a summer picnic is going to be at, we're going to visit the Jeremiah Horrocks Observatory in Preston. The observatory built specially for the 1927 total solar eclipse seen over northwest and northeast England, if you remember. And there'll be a tour of the observatory, there'll be lectures, and we will be the guests of Prescott and District Astronomical Societies, and also the Jeremiah Horrocks Institute associated with the University of Central Lancashire, and they are providing us with refreshments. So there'll be an opportunity for just 30 members to go to the summer picnic. So we'll put some additional information and booking information out to you as soon as we can. But that's Saturday, the 1st of July for the summer picnic. And just a quick reminder that we will hopefully have our AGM and autumn conference in Birmingham at the BMI on October the 21st, Saturday, October the 21st. But again, more information later. Without further ado, I'd like to carry on our conference, and it's a great privilege and honor for me to introduce our next speaker, Carolyn Kennett. But before I do, Carolyn has got the honor of delivering the very first Michael Hoskin Memorial Lecture for the Society. Michael, who has sadly left us in 2021, was a great supporter of the SHA when it was first established in the summer of 2002. He became the first of our two Society Honorary Vice Presidents, along with Sir Patrick Moore. He was a preeminent and world-renowned historian of astronomy, plus many branches of science, and of course was notable for research articles and many books on William Herschel, his sister Caroline, and the wider Herschel family. And he's also remembered for his archaeological astronomy on the Mediterranean tombs. Founder of the successful journal for the history of astronomy, which he was editor for many, many years. And he was also honored with by the International Astronomical Union having an asteroid named after him. He is greatly missed, and he was a remarkable and extraordinary energetic historian, marked by his scholarship and engaging teaching and personal encouragement for many students of not just astronomical history, but the broader sciences. Allow me to introduce Carolyn Kennett to you. FRAS. She is a writer, researcher, and astronomer who lives in Cornwall. She researches ancient communities and how they made connections to their landscapes. She is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and her books include Sites of Prehistoric Modbin Moor in 2022, Uranus and Neptune in 2022, Celestial Stone Circles of West Cornwall, published in 2018, and Neptune, From the Grand Discovery to World Revealed, published in 2021. She's a communicator of all things astronomical and runs her own walking tours and outreach business, Archaeoastronomy Cornwall, while being director of Myers Creative, who deliver arts and science and heritage projects throughout Cornwall. The title of her presentation is Dolcoath Mine Experiments, Airy, Well, and Their Attempts to Weigh the World. In 1826 and 1828, attempts were made by a group of eminent scientists, including George Biddle Airy and William Wellawell, to measure the density of the Earth. They would travel to the far southwest of England, to Cornwall, and down the deepest mine in the country at Dolcoath to undertake the experiment. Both attempts were beset by challenges, including, unfortunately, smashing one of the precious pendulums. From 2021 to 2022, a group of enthusiasts are going to recreate the experiments within the Cornish mine, led by Carolyn Kennett, FRAS, and this talk will explore both the past and modern versions of the experiments as we descend into the bowels of the earth to try and weigh the world. And before I finally introduce her, can I remind you all that Dr. Alan Chapman has produced our fourth LAS booklet, which is on sale at the moment for £14 postage free, just at the moment to SHA members. We haven't gone really public about it yet. And to our foreign, Europe and beyond members, it's £14, but postage is negotiable because prices for overseas postage has gone up recently. So contact the Society and we'll get a copy of you very, very soon. Our 50 initial printing has almost diminished. I've got one left, which is this one. So if you need to order some, there may be a slight delay, but I truly do recommend it. And Carolyn's talk, which is about to begin, will supplement it. Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you. I will share my screen. I think that's a good start. Get that shared. Okay, Gerard, is that looking okay?
Yeah, that's great, Carolyn. Over to you, Dara.
Okay. I just wanted to say what an honour it is, and thank you to you, Gerard, and the rest of the SHA for asking me to give the first Michael Hopkins lecture. I had a small amount of involvement chatting to him via email during his latter years, mostly to do with my other passion, which is archaeoastronomy. And he had been to Cornwall and to the Isles of Scilly to make measurements of orientations of Selonian style passage graves. That work was unpublished, but I do have all the material from that, and possibly down the line I could look at adding to that and maybe producing something which builds on his original measurements of the ones that he took on the Isles of Scilly. But I'm going to talk about this, which has kept me occupied for the last couple of years, something slightly different. And this is a Cornish mine experiment where we have these eminent scientists coming to Cornwall in the early 1820s to make measurements of the density of the earth. And it was really interesting for me to listen to Carolyn Bedwell's talk, because there we go. Because she mentioned about the longitude problem and the solution of the Harrison clocks not being the final solution that everyone perhaps thought that they were. As we know that as well as being incredibly expensive objects and very difficult to replicate for many years, so people have to still rely on other methods to find longitude at sea. One of the other problems which was found with chronometers, the first steps of chronometers coming through, was that the pendulum oscillations, there were slight changes in these as people went around the planet in their boats with these chronometers. There would be slight changes, and those changes were directly attributed to the gravity and the force of gravity pulling on the oscillation springs. And this was the main problem, which brought the scientist, George Biddle-Airy, to his attention to have a go at solving this problem. Now, it was known that pendulums were affected by gravity for quite a long time. And the British scientist Francis Bacon in 1620, he proposed using a pendulum. He actually used the pendulum to start to try and measure gravity. It was soon realized, about 50 years later, that if you ran pendulums at different places, that the gravity acting on it would vary the pendulum rate. And Isaac Newton was able to show in his wonderful mathematics book that he could show that the pendulums would change rate due to latitude as well as due to height. So altitude as well would affect the rate of a pendulum. So when I'm talking about a pendulum, I'm talking about a free swinging pendulum, a pendulum which is not pushed or acted upon by a spring mechanism. So slightly different to those pendulums held within the chronometers. We move forward quite a long way to the 1820s, and we are getting quite a few pendulum experiments happening. And Carlini is doing this pendulum experiment up a mountain in Italy. So he has a pendulum at the top of the mountain, one at the base, and he's pulling out some fairly reasonable results in how much gravitational difference there was and how much that would relate to the density of the Earth. And he found at that time that the density of the Earth was about 4.39, sorry, that of water itself, and that's a mean density. His figures were then recalculated later on, and they got to a figure of 4.77 to the density of the Earth. Current value has a mean density of about 5.5. So he was getting quite close with that. But George Biddleary was very interested in this problem, but there was another issue with the pendulums themselves, which made it very difficult to actually get very accurate results. And the difficulty came from the manufacture of the pendulum, the free swinging pendulum. So there was some parts of the pendulum which gave challenges to the observers. One of these was the shafts, and the shafts themselves, the long part of the pendulum, was made from different materials. So some manufacturers preferred to make them from brass, which is quite a malleable material, and it at times was highly affected by temperature. So at times it would expand and then it would decrease. Other people made pure wooden pendulums. Other people made mixtures of materials of pendulums, and certainly the pendulums which they went on to use within the mine experiments in Cornwall, they had a variety of materials involved, but they have been able to solve one of the main problems, and that was measuring the length of the pendulum and how long it hung. So you might think that was quite an obvious thing to be able to do, but if you've got an object which could expand with temperature, it was very difficult for them to get a pendulum which would hang at the right length to be ticking at the 1 second. And what a young man called Henry Catar came along and did was he made a pendulum which could be reversed. So it's actually hanging upside down in that image there. So you can see the bob at the top. So this pendulum would swing one way and then you could reverse it and swing the other way. And to get the pendulum swinging at the same values, there is a small piece of metal which sits around it, which can be moved up and down the shaft to balance it out correctly. So you can swing it one way up, turn it the other way up, and by moving this small attachment, this bracket, up and down the shaft, you can get it to swing to the 1 second perfectly. So he's made this pendulum which allows people to take incredibly accurate measurements, and that's what was needed for these experiments to succeed. So reversible pendulums, which Henry Catar made, were soon being manufactured, and this one is pretty much immediately after he'd come up with the solution. It's seen here in India, taking measurements of gravity in Madras. And you can see that it's an instrument that's hanging from the ceiling. So there's a bracket on the ceiling there, and it hangs on a bracketed piece of metal, which has something called knife edges. So the knife edges are to remove as much friction as possible from this free swinging pendulum. And knife edges were also an area of many challenges where the pendulums wouldn't sit correctly, and manufacturers often, and the people running the experiments often had to spend many hours working out how to position knife edges so they worked to the optimum. The pendulum itself is hanging in front of something that looks like a clock. This is a high precision clock or a regulator. And the measurements would be taken by, as you can see, the young man on the bottom left-hand side, looking through a little sight. And what he is looking for is, as the pendulum in the front, the Qatar invariable pendulum, swings, it will swing freely, as I said, about 1 second for each swing. But the regulator pendulum behind is being pushed on by a spring in the clock, and they are going to swing apart. So gradually, as they're swinging apart, there will be a moment when they start to move together. And there will be this moment called a coincidence where the two pendulums suddenly swing together in unison. And that's what they were measuring. So he's looking through a very small telescopic sighting instrument to look for a white dot on the front pendulum, which will then go onto the back pendulum when they all line up in a line. So he's looking for them coming together. And a 1 second pendulum would come together about every 40 to 45 minutes. So it's not something that would happen that quickly. You would have this moment of excitement as they came together and they swung together, and then they would gradually move apart again, and you could leave the experiment running for many, many hours, and time between these coincidences all coming together. So what is the Cornish connection? Well, George Biddle-Airy started thinking about this problem with chronometers and thinking about the different levels of density of the Earth and the gravitational pull on it. He wasn't the Astronomer Royal at this point. He was still quite a young man. He graduated at Trinity College, and he was now a fellow at this college in Cambridge. While he started to consider this problem. He spoke to another fellow at Trinity College, William Whewell, and they were to discuss the ideas about where they could undertake these experiments. And William Whewell was to accompany him into the Peak District, and they looked at a mine called Exton Mine, and they found that it wasn't suitable for the experiment. So William Whewell, he had a conversation with John Herschel, the astronomer John Herschel, asking if he knew anywhere where himself and George Biddle-Airy could undertake the experiment to find out the density of the Earth. And John Herschel suggested they write to a physician who was in Cornwall, and this physician's name was John Ayrton Parris. And John Ayrton Parris, he was a physician who worked in Cornish mines. He was particularly interested in the impact of explosions on miners' capabilities with breathing. So there was a lot of dynamite was being used in the Cornish mines. It's very hard rock granite, so they were exploding all the time underground, creating a huge amount of dust and dangerous material into the air, which these miners at that point were breathing in. And this physician was looking at the impact of that on the miners. But he was very helpful to Airy and Whewell, and he immediately wrote back and he said, well, you need to come to this mine just outside Camborne in West Cornwall called Dolcoath. And he knew the owner, Lord Dunstanville, and he gave them an introduction. So there was letters written, and it was agreed that they could come down in the summer of 1826 to conduct their experiments in the mine. Now, Dolcoath Mine, and this is a drawing of Dolcoath Mine from 1832, just after the Whewell and Airy had been to Cornwall, and it gives quite a nice romantic impression of what it would look like at the surface. And I'll show you some images a little bit later on, which were more true to what would be going on. But it was an ideal location for them to come down in their head, because it was the deepest mine in Britain at that point. It offers them 1,200 feet of difference in altitude from the bottom of the mine to the surface. So as they would descend, they could descend far enough to get reasonable results from running two pendulums. Dolcoath mine itself wasn't a traditional tin mine, as you would expect it to be in Cornwall. It was a copper mine. It produced the most amount of copper out of any mine in Cornwall, and it was a working environment, and that is really key to the story. It was also extracting minerals such as arsenic, silver, gold, and tin, along with the copper. This in some ways does show a scene of the surface where there are the ladies, the bow maidens at the surface, and they would be working the material that came up from the ground and extracting it from the rock. So they would often be the ones using the arsenic to extract the tin and copper from the granite. And then you can see the miners in the background descending into the ground or lowering a kibble, as it's known, a large iron bucket into the ground then. But these were dirty working places and quite dangerous. And we know quite a lot about Dolcoath mine because in the early 1800s, the mine was managed by two mine managers who kept notes in what was known as a mine management book, and it was called a day and night book because one of them wrote what had occurred in the mine in the day for the handover for the manager to come on at night, and he left then notes overnight at what had happened in the mine. And this book has actually been published and was written between 1822 to 1823, so about 3 years before Airy and Whewell ended up at Dolcoath. We have a huge amount of material about the mine itself. One of the things which would have, if they'd read, which probably would have concerned them before they come down, was the access into the mine. So access into the mine at this time was by ladder, and there was no man engines, and there was certainly no access by cages going up and down. You had to actually descend on the ladders all the way, the 1,200 feet. And I'm going to read a little passage out of the day and night book, which was written about the ladders. So it says, accidents relating to ladders were a major problem throughout Cornish mines, especially before man engines and cages were used to take the men from their workplaces. Here, John Harris, a miner from Dolcoath, describes the scores of ladders he had to descend to his workplace, many of them lying at odd angles and some of them very poorly fixed. Travelling with only candle for light, slippery rungs, loose ladders and huge drops all meant that serious injury or death were constantly in attendance while climbing up and down the many hundreds of feet. And one of the perhaps more shocking realizations when I started researching into this was that many of the miners would have descended fine into the mine, do a full day's work, but it was as they started to ascend back up to the surface that tiredness would overcome them. Maybe they hadn't had enough food in their working day, or maybe they were just exhausted by the long hours underground, and that would be when they would fall off the ladders. And certainly there was miners all the time during those 2 years of the mine book falling off ladders into the depths of the mine itself. There wasn't a huge amount of health and safety there. So not the most ideal location to run an experiment. The other thing that I should say about running an experiment is that they were going to operate with 2 locations. So the first location would have been very similar to the one on the left. It would have been a very clear, scientifically laid out location at the surface, and they managed to acquire a small house, a small cottage next to the surface of one of the shafts in which to do this. So they could have cleaned that up and made it almost like a very lab scientific-like location to run the experiment. The second observation location was going to be at the bottom of the mine. And as you can see on the right there, that's an image from a little bit later than they went into the mine, but you can get an idea of how dirty, how unregulated the space is. And it would have been a very difficult place to run an experiment, a precision experiment. So the two pendulums that were taken with them from London were called Foster and Hall. And it's interesting because one of them might have been the pendulum in that very early image from 1821 in Madras, because that was Foster sat on the side observing that pendulum. So there is a question mark as to whether that was actually one of the pendulums which ended up in the mine with them. The pendulums were put separately, one underground and one on the surface. And then the idea is that they would be hung and run in front of the regulators with chronometers, also checking the timing. And I think they had 8 chronometers between them for the first attempt in 1826. And after a number of days of running these two pendulums, the idea would be that one of them would be lifted from the depths of Dolcoath, and then the other one on the surface would be taken underground. So they would be swapped over. So they could take out as much error as possible between the two pendulums, which may have had their own personalities, because a lot of this equipment, as we know, this old type equipment, it had foibles and personality about it, which would add into the results of the experiment. Airy and Hewell were on their own doing this. They were given an assistant by the mine managers, but they would spend, one of them would spend 6 to 8 hours in the hut at the surface, and the other one 6 to 8 hours underground in the dark space, where they would be watching for these coincidences. So if you think back, there would be these coincidences about every 40 minutes, and then they would have quite a gap underground of just sitting there, listening to the creaks, the explosions of the dynamite, the dripping water, all the other strange noises. And certainly Hewell writes letters underground. He writes a letter to a lady aunt of his, telling her all about the experience of being underground and everything. And it was quite disconcerting, I think, for them. Now, once they had run these experiments for a little while, they attempted to lift one of the pendulums back to the surface. And this is where things got a little bit tricky. So they were using kibbles. So the kibbles are these big buckets which lift up and down, and miners were known to ride the kibbles because it was a faster way of getting down than climbing the ladders or ride them back up. With their real kind of lack of health and safety. They were using the kibbles to transport the equipment in, so the pendulum, the regulators, the chronometers, and then they were climbing the ladders themselves. And towards the end of August, they decided to swap over the two pendulums, and as they lifted Foster from the depths of the surface, and as the kibble came back to the top, the bottom of the kibble had been burnt out, and there was nothing left in the kibble itself. So Foster, the pendulum, and a number of other bits of equipment had dropped all the way to the bottom of the mine floor and smashed the smithereens at the bottom. So Airy actually went down to the bottom and he saw the bits and pieces, and the miners helped him collect some of it back up. So it was kind of a really difficult thing for them at the time to come back to London, because Airy was only just starting out, and he wasn't the Astronomer Royal yet. He didn't have the connections, those high-end connections, and he actually came back and write a very apologetic letter about how he'd lost this pendulum, and also he'd also smashed one of the chronometers, the glass on one of the chronometers. So I think he was very worried about the reaction that he was going to get from that back in London and at Cambridge. Now, there was a question over whether this was an accident or whether it was sabotage, and the miners themselves were highly superstitious and particularly looked upon Hewell and Airy with very superstitious eyes. Airy was seen one Sunday on the Sabbath with his back to the church laughing, and he was accused of being the devil. So you can see in kind of this remote location of Britain, people still had real superstitions, and they were really worried about their own ability to work. And all of a sudden, you've got these two people from further up the line doing this experiment, which kind of got in the way of them getting about their everyday business of mining and making money. And because it's interesting, because miners would they would buy a section of mine of which they then had to mine, and that would be their money. You didn't know when you bought that section of mine whether there would be any tin or copper or anything of value in there, but you still had to mine it. So if you had people in your way, or you were pulled off of work to go and help them, you could see that it might have been frustrating for you. So that first attempt ended up in disaster, but it didn't stop Airy. He came back, and he came back to Dolcoath. It sat with him for a couple of years, and he thought, I want to have another go. He brought back Hewell with him, but he also brought a bigger team. So with him this time came Richard Sheepshanks, an astronomer, and Adam Sedgwick, who's a geologist, and two other students, assistants, who would help them. And the idea would be that they would set up the surface experiment area, and then they would set up underground again in the mine. But the difference this time was that they were going to man the stations permanently. They would do 8-hour shifts, and they would man that station underground and the one on the surface 24/7 for as long as they possibly could. There was 2 pendulums came down with them this time. They were different pendulums, once again named after their previous owners. They were Brisbane and Sabine. And once again, the idea would be one would be placed at the bottom and one at the top, and then swapped over after a certain amount of time to take out the error involved. Sheepshanks was going to man the upstairs observatory with one of the assistants and Sedgwick permanently, and Airy would be in charge of the underground experiment. And Airy, being Airy, he decided that he would attend every changeover of person personally. So every 8 hours, he had to be in the bottom of the mine to watch the changeover in case there would be a coincidence during that changeover. And he also wanted to be there to when the pendulum itself needed to slow and it needed to be re-pushed, he wanted to be the person doing that to reignite the pendulum. So he was intending on not getting a huge amount of sleep, but he was also putting himself up for a huge amount of climbing up and down those ladders, and he must have been quite a fit and active person to do that. Bringing Adam Sedgwick with them changed the experiment in some ways, because Adam Sedgwick, he had lots of aristocratic friends. So instead of staying on site next to Dolcoath, they stayed in stately homes. They went out for evening meals when things were being tested and set up. They were going out for nice meals round all the aristocratic families in Cornwall. Sedgwick was running field trips, as I would call them, to lots of different geological sites which were interesting him. So certainly he was down on the Lizard, and he was at Land's End looking at different geological features. And they certainly were out and about much more, involving themselves in Cornish life. So There's a bit in one of the books about them being out on a boat and Sedgwick pushing Airy into the sea and things like that. So it wasn't just the mine experiment. One of the issues and why they had more time down here was that one of the pendulum's knife edges wasn't settling in very well, and Sheepshanks was very involved with trying to fix that problem before they could actually go for another run at this experiment. So they were down for about 6 weeks before Sheepshanks was happy with the running of the two pendulums, and they had quite a bit of time on their hands. But then on the 16th of August, they felt that they could actually have a go at the experiment again. And they got the two pendulums running, one at the surface, one underground, and these would run for the next 3 days. And unfortunately, they were going to be beaten for a different reason this time. And that is because the mine itself underwent a collapse and it started to flood at the lower depth. So I've got in another book here just a little bit about that collapse. But first of all, at the end of the 1828 experiment, they were invited to Lord Dunstanville's manor house in Tahiti, which is just about 5 miles away from Dolcoath, and he was the owner of Dolcoath mine. And they presented him with, the adventurers, as they would be known, presented him with a candelabra, which was 40 pounds in silver weight. And there was 20 guests at this meal. And as I said, they went to quite a few of these lovely meals, but this was the ending meal, which was to say thank you for allowing them to use the mine for this experiment. As I said, the experiment came to an end because a collapse happened in Dolcoath. And it's written about here, and it says, during 1828, a remarkable subsidence occurred at Dolcoath. It neither extended far from the lodes nor reached the surface, and the greatest movement continued for several weeks. The greatest inconvenience was to the pump. So there was no mention of the inconvenience to the adventurers there, even though they'd had this lovely meal and everything with Lord Dunstanville. But so it shows the priority was still about this being a working mine. So it wasn't the end of the mine experiments. It was for Airy, although Edwin Duncan, his assistant, would have another attempt at this, and this image is from that next attempt. This later attempt happened at Harton Mine, not in Cornwall, but up north. And they would carry on with these experiments until a real figure was, a much more modern figure was found out about the gravitational force, the gravitational pull and the density of the Earth. So in all, they made 127 hours of observation, and they found that there was a 4 second a day gravitational force, a difference between those pendulums, which is quite a lot, but it still enabled them to pull out a figure for the gravity of the Earth, and they got quite close to the actual figure which we have today. So this is what interested me, and I got chatting with a number of friends. I don't know how to do that. So, oh yes, I was going to just show you some pictures of the area on maps at the time. So this one is from the 1840s. So this is after they visited, and it shows that there is quite a local town called Camborne starting to be built. Dolcoath mine is in the middle at the top there, just to the right where all the blue parts are. They're kind of bits of water and everything to do with the mining. But certainly it was getting quite developed, and this shows you the area itself with lots of shafts and everything. It was quite an extensive operation. The surface, so this was subsurface, would have looked like this when they were there. So these are the adits and the shafts. Now, if you can consider, I don't know if you can see my little mouse there, but on the top of the dark grey area underneath the contours. These are mine houses. So look how tiny they are in comparison to the shafts which run down underground. And these were the types of things that they were trying to defend. And no easy task, especially with precision equipment. That's what the surface would have looked like. It would have been quite a barren landscape as they was extracting material which was very dangerous and dirty. They were using arsenic. There was arsenic work within half a mile of Dolcoath mine. And there was a huge amount of work there, huge amount of shafts. So these mines sprung up gradually over time, as originally they used to be individuals or just small conglomerates of people would join together and have 2 or 3 mine shafts, but gradually they became bigger and bigger offerings. And this kind of shows you the scale. This is Dolcoath a little bit later in the 1870s, but it shows you the scale of what was on the ground. Even when they were there in the 1820s, it was kind of peaking in the 1820s. This is how it looks today. So this is the east shaft. There isn't a lot to see on the ground anymore. It's kind of it's waste / parkland, so people walk their dogs there and things. But the ground itself is it's been poisoned quite badly with all the different waste and chemicals, but it's amazing how much life can come back. The Red River, which ran through the valley underneath, which provided all the water for the mining, that was cleaned up quite a few years ago, and it gets its name Red River because it was the amount of iron running through it used to make it still red into the Hale estuary. And this is quite an interesting building. So this is just opposite the other one, which I've just shown you now. This is the Count House. So in the original experiment in 1826, this is the building that Whewell and Airy stayed in. So they weren't staying in the manor houses at that point. They actually stayed in the Count House. Now, the Count House had a few functions. As well as being the place where the managers for the mine would stay, it would also be the place where all the money and the shareholders used to descend monthly to have the wages and have the money paid out to them from their shares in the mine. And those occasions used to be quite big occasions. So I'm sure Airy and Whewell would have been there when these shareholders would have descended for their monthly payout and meeting, and there would have been a lot of alcohol and feasting involved at that point because the mine was extremely productive at that point. It's now a tea room, so if you ever do come down to Cornwall and visit, it's got quite a nice tea room in there. But what's also interesting about this space is that the interior is kind of has house clearance, but most of it is in the traditional rooms that it would have been in when Whewell and Airy haven't had a huge amount of interior changing and redecoration. So the ceilings and everything and the cornicing and the lighting and things is all very similar to how it would have been in their days. So it's an interesting space to wander around, thinking that that's where they ended up staying during that first experiment. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit now about what we did back in 21 and 22, but this kind of has a longer history. I met me on the left, I met Dr. Edward Gillen in 2019 when he was running experiments about with a magnetic dipping needle. He was about to head off round Africa with this magnetic dipping needle, going to St. Helena and coming back through. So he's quite interested in recreation experiments, and they found this working dipping needle in the Polly in Falmouth, which belonged to Ware Fox, and he was able to take that with him on a boat and do some dipping needle experiments. Absolutely fascinating story. But he was very interested in Dolcoath as well, because one of his aunts had lived with her house over some of the underground workings of Dolcoath. And he can remember laying on the ground and listening to the underground moving. You can actually hear it creaking and moving as the wooden joints and struts and things move and everything else. It's quite disconcerting. Few of you will know Daniel Beltiki. He gave the talk about George Biddle Transit Wheel, and I met him in early 2020 at Greenwich, where he was working at the time. And he was also very interested because of his love of Airy and instrumentation as well. And we came up with this plan very early on to have a go at recreating these experiments. One of the problems was Dolcoath has been flooded, so we knew immediately that we couldn't use Dolcoath as a mine. So I started asking around Cornwall and asking my contacts of if there was a mine that was open and you could get access into still today and it hadn't been flooded with water. I got suggested to go to this mine here. It's called Rosevale Mine. It's a few miles outside of St Ives in Venner. And Rosevale Mine is a mine which has been mined. It's an area of land which has been mined since the early medieval times, but it's not at the same extent that you would find at Dolcoath. So these are the plans for Rosevale. There's more to it than that, but these are the main adits and shafts at Rosevale. There are 2 levels, and both of them come out into the hillside. So actually, you've got a level 1, which is quite high up the hill, and then you've got a lower level, which is at the bottom of the hill. So the mine is actually in the hill itself, rather than going from a flat level surface and then going underground, although they are starting to extract now from the deep adit and find lower levels. This is an ongoing project run by mine volunteers. So these are ex-miners, ex-mining engineers, and they're ex-mine archaeologists. They're all hugely enthusiastic, and they're all volunteers, and they run this place as something to go and do on a Saturday and go and extract in and try and work out some of the old techniques that these miners were using and things to mine in Cornwall, because it's interesting. There is a huge swathe of kind of knowledge which has been lost, particularly about different types of machinery or different techniques within mining, and this is what they're trying to work out. So when I approached them, they were very generous, both with their mining knowledge. I knew absolutely nothing about mining, but they were very generous with that, but also with their time and allowing us to use the mine for this experiment. So we already knew that the experiment wouldn't be anywhere near as accurate as Airy and Whewell's experiment, just because we weren't going to get the depth from the surface all the way underground. We weren't going to get the same level of altitude difference between the two stations. But we thought it would still be interesting to do, to learn about some of the issues, particularly around the pendulum and the hanging of pendulums and the challenges of running an experiment such as this one. This is inside the mine, and this was one of my first visits, and I was so excited because on the right there is a kibble, and I knew about the story of the kibble being burnt out by the superstitious, probably by the superstitious miners, and the bottom falling out and the loss of the pendulum. And I just love the idea that even though this is a very, very small kibble, some of them are huge, as you could see, which would carry people. I was just very excited by that. So I was kind of pleased that we got the opportunity to use this mine. These are pictures from the left is the exterior, the bottom level of the mine, and it has a little gauge railway track going in with a little kind of engine which goes in and out to help extract material. The person in the middle with our back to us is Wayne Ridgway. He was absolutely key and instrumental to this happening. He's an expert miner. He's also one of the people that knows Rosevale mine the best. but he also is a member of the Royal Horological Society and an expert clock mender maker, and he took it upon himself to make the pendulum for the experiment. So I chatted to him on a number of occasions, and he said, I'm really interested in having a go at making one of these Qatar pendulums. And I was like, my gosh, no, this is all my Christmases at once, basically. So he said he would take that on, and we could run the experiment there. I just wanted to show you this one because this one shows Daniel, I think, or Edward at the bottom, and then the ladders going up the wall. So we still had 2 levels, and there was 100 feet for these ladders. And these ladders, so there's no man engine or cage in this one, that you have to do the ladders between the 2 levels. And very similarly to some of those stories about ladders in Dolcoath, I wasn't very keen on the ladders because I did find that they kind of came away from the wall in places a little bit. And some points you were kind of very free swinging. Other times you were very tight with both the wall at your back and your foot hardly on the ladder rung. It all felt a little unsafe to me. And it's funny seeing the older miner volunteers who were scampering up and down the ladders, no problem. But yeah, I think that's years of expertise compared to me, who was a little bit worried about these ladders, to be honest with you. Daniel was lucky enough to help in us getting to view one of these pendulums. The pendulums themselves are incredibly rare. We found that the Science Museum in London had one of these pendulums on display, and it was owned by the Royal Society, so we had to go to the Royal Society and ask permission for it to come off the display. And this was all happening in 2020 when we'd had all the challenges around access and COVID and all of that. But we were very lucky that one of the curators at the Science Museum was able to take out this pendulum from its display case, and we were able to take measurements of things like the knife edges and start to think about the mounting of the pendulum, because one of the things we didn't really understand was exactly how the mounting worked. And we had to go through a number of different methods before we settled on one that we were happy with as well. This is Wayne actually setting up on the day that we were going to run the experiment, and you can see that he's got a clock with this white dot on its pendulum at the back. He hasn't actually hung the free swinging Qatar pendulum as yet in front of it. He's just getting the clock running and the timing's right on the clock. So he used a number of parts to mock us up a regulator. A proper regulator clock of this size would be about £20,000, and it's certainly not something that we were willing to take into a dirty kind of mine environment. It was incredibly damp. There's water dripping off the ceiling and a lot of dirt. The granite walls, they kind of drip and they fall apart. So you think of the granite as a very hard substance, but it's not. With water running down it, it kind of starts to disintegrate. So there's mess everywhere. But he was very kind in that he had Richard Trevithick, who is famous in Camborne for creating steam engines. And we have Richard Trevithick Day down here. He had Richard Trevithick's pendulum from another clock, which he used in this one to keep it with the Cornish and Camborne related period. And it's from that period, but he also managed to get a regulator face from a local auction house, and he mocked up the whole clock with the regulator face and this pendulum from the period in it, and it ran beautifully. So he made us a regulator to work in the mine. We then hung the free swinging Qatar pendulum, which Wayne made for us in front of the clock. So you can see it there in the middle and in the left-hand pictures hanging. We actually bracketed to the ceiling. As I said, one of the conversations that we had was about mounts. and whether we would have a tripod or some sort of mounting system which would lean up against the walls. And then we just kind of realized, well, the ceiling of the mine is probably the best thing to mount it off, pretty much like in that picture of India and the Madras experiment from 1821, where they bracketed onto the wall. We did the same thing, but we bracketed across the ceiling, and then we were able to start swinging the two. We illuminated by candlelight. We had various attempts at sighting things. We've got a little brass sighting scope there on the right-hand side, which is in this kind of blue plasticky holder, but it is a little brass one which Brian Sheen provided, who has the observatory in Cornwall, and it dates from the 1800s as well. It was quite difficult to see through, even in the best conditions, but then you start getting it under candlelight, and it was made quite a tricky thing to watch through. And we would be sitting there, so we decided we would take shifts, much as Sewell and Airy, and I was lucky enough to be asked to take the first shift and sit there watching these two pendulums as they gradually move together. And then I was watching for this moment where the wooden shaft on the Qatar pendulum, which is the one hanging in front, would swing over the white dot on the pendulum in the regulated clock behind. And you could tell when that was going to happen because they gradually swing together. But there is this moment where you're watching them through this little sighting instrument that it all becomes very kind of tricky. And I think for me, because we all said different things, it was interesting as observers. There was myself, Daniel, and Edward all observed these coincidences over the day. We all saw different things, which is something which we found quite interesting. But for me, it felt like I was having to use averted vision as much as you do when you look through a telescope. And I suppose that comes from me being an astronomer who's been told to use averted vision to get the most kind of material out of an observing session. And it looked like it was going to eclipse the white dot, and then eventually it did eclipse it just for a number of swings. So it kind of came and swung, and it would only come into your sight line a little bit, and then you've got to think it's swinging away. So it's going to swing in and start to eclipse, and then the next time it eclipses even more. And then finally it fully eclipsed this regulator white dot. But what happened was it seemed to eclipse it once, and then it kind of got exposed again, and then it eclipsed it a second time. And I wasn't the only person to see that. Edward also fed back that that's what he saw, whereas Daniel saw something slightly different. He just saw it eclipse it once. But yeah, it was interesting to say that we were all three quite competent observers, and we all saw different things. But the timings were all very accurate, which was good. We got coincidences about every 45 minutes with about a 1 or 2 second accuracy of difference over the course of the afternoon. So it was quite interesting. So when we were sat there, that's the picture on the left, that's where we'd be sat. So we were quite a distance away, if you've got to think, from the actual clock itself, and it was illuminated by candlelight. So we were trying to make our notes under darkness with candlelight. We had another expert involved. His name was Adam Sharp. He was absolutely wonderful in helping us. He was an archaeologist who what he doesn't know about mining isn't worth knowing in Cornwall. So that was his job. His whole life was with the archaeological unit, all about the mining heritage here in Cornwall. So he had a huge amount of help which he gave us to do with the mine and the conditions that they would have sat in and observed in. It was an incredibly surreal experience being in there yourself. So once everyone cleared out and the noise of the place cleared out, and you're left with the noise of the mine, it was peaceful in some ways, but then you would get these moments where it would creak or groan and the earth would do something that would be quite unsettling. And although I knew that I wasn't that far from the exit, you know, I was probably 300-400 feet from the exit, down one of these adits. It still felt like you were very much on your own in there. And well, we were, but it still felt like, well, if something goes wrong, you know, I'm kind of down here on my own now. And but it was quite exciting in some ways to do something like that. And hopefully you'll hear this. This is some sound of the clock ticking. So that's the other thing. It was an incredibly beautiful thing to listen to the clock ticking with the sounds of the mine going on. So I'll just play this and hopefully it's quite quiet. So there was just this, as I say, this accompaniment to nothingness with this ticking clock, and then this kind of and the dripping and everything else. So it made for a very unusual place to be sat on your own on one Saturday. Airy wrote a poem about his time at Dolcoath. This is the poem about the pendulum which fell after the first experiment in 1826. And I'll just read it to you. It says, "The ladders of mighty Dolcoath I descended, through caverns that yawned like an entrance to hell. All was silent, save when through the levels came blended the roar of the blast and the kibble's deep knell. To the right, a vile path round the south shaft was bending. Behind, a chain ladder from hooks was depending. Our station's white door in the front was ascending, when I marked the sad spot where the pendulum fell. Dark and drear was the spot in Dolcoath's deepest level, where the pendulum fragments were scattered around, as when, at the close of some drunken men's revel, broken bottles and plates encumber the ground. Yet through scattered they lay, not entirely neglected, for the men who had packed them with spirits dejected, and mid cattle and deeds the small pieces selected and sent up to the grass all the bits that they found." Now that's not the entire poem, but it's just a part of it. And I think it says everything about his feelings about what he experienced and the dejection that he had. It must have been awful seeing that kibble come up to the top and no pendulum in it. It must have been an awful moment for him, and yeah, quite humbling, I suppose. I also wanted to say that in Truro Cathedral, we have a wonderful stained glass window to Dolcoath, to the people working at Dolcoath, and there were many lives lost in there. Even during the time that the two experiments were going on, people lost their lives. It was a really dangerous location to be working, and it continued to be dangerous even after safety was put in, such as the cages and the man engines themselves. So people risked a lot to work in these spaces. So it was incredibly brave of Airy and Fuel to come from Cambridge and their kind of closeted lives, and to put themselves down one of these very dirty, dark spaces to run this experiment. And it shows the determination that they had to find solutions to some of these problems that they considered needed proper solutions to. And with that, I think I'm done. So thank you.
Well, that was absolutely splendid. I must admit, I'm as my grandmother would say, I'm gobsmacked. I really am.
I'm going to stop the share.
It's reminiscent of my time when we built the LaSalle replica 24-inch. Mm-hmm. Whether it was a replica or not, we had to confine ourselves to modern day health and safety. We couldn't build what we wanted to build, yet you've done almost an identical experiment, and you have to be warmly congratulated about what you did. So splendid. I'm sure
we were just incredibly lucky that there was a mine that we could use with people that weren't so completely tied to health and safety that it wouldn't allow us to go ahead. yeah, there was, you know, obviously we were wearing proper helmets and things like that, but yeah, there were moments where you're thinking, this is the reality of it. This is what they would have come into. It was yeah, inspiring.
Well, I'm sorry, I used my chairman's prerogative there. There must be other questions. Any questions from anybody in the audience, please? Kevin.
Just some of the practicalities of the experiment. The free pendulum, I assume you have to, how long does it actually stay in motion between being released? And because 45 minutes isn't the length of time it will actually swing initially, will it?
No.
You have to presumably let it go every so often, do you?
Yeah, so it needs to be re-impulsed every so often. So, but yeah, we were very surprised because that was another kind of unknown. There's so many unknowns in this, and so you know, we were looking through books and things. But Wayne, when he built the pendulum and started to run it in his own workshop, he found it was running for about 8 hours before it needed re-impulsing, which is just incredible. So he'd managed to get it on these knife edges with very little friction, and it was running for an incredibly long time, which surprised us all because we were expecting, oh, it'll only run for about half an hour, and then, you know, but as you say, they've had to take into account the re-impulses in their calculations as well. But these things ran for a long time in the way that they set them up.
So you're saying it would run for about 8 hours without?
Yeah, before it was pushed again. So in the mine itself, we had it running for about, I think it was 4 hours before we re-impulsed. We decided it was slowing down and re-impulsed. But then that's different conditions. You've got a lot of humidity. There was temperature differences in the mine, and yeah, so there's a lot more to take into account once you put yourself into that environment.
Can I just ask you, you mentioned about the ladders. The ladders system was similar to what they encountered.
Yeah. So there's different types of ladders. There's fixed ladders, which would be fixed to the mine wall, but the mine wall isn't a straight, like a standard building wall. Yeah. It's in like this, but they would fix it to position. So there's parts where your foot probably only just gets onto the rung, which is up against a piece of, or it might even be sticking out over the rung, and you can't get onto that rung, which I found disconcerting, and you're down another one. And then there's other times where it's free hanging, and you can feel the ladder kind of free hanging like this. And but the other types of ladders, which I never did, which they do also have, and they would scamper up and down, are kind of more metal chain ladders, which just looked horrific to me and beyond my pay grade. So they kind of free up against the wall, and they would go up like chain ladders, like you would a rope ladder. But, yeah. So I'm assuming that they would have had a mixture of the two in Dolcoath as well. From the sound.
Carolyn's got a hand up, Gerard.
Yes, Carolyn, please.
It seems there's a long history of astronomers trying to get delicate equipment to work in places that really aren't suitable for it.
Yeah, I think that's the big surprise, isn't it? Is how do you get this equipment to work in such a dirty space? And also struggling with, temperatures wouldn't change too much. They were pretty standard, but particularly down in Dolcoath, it was exceptionally hot. I know that they all complained about how hot it was in Dolcoath once you get really down far into a mine, whereas we didn't have that so bad because we weren't at those depths, but the temperature was static, but humidity would change an awful lot. So if it had been a particularly wet period, it would be absolutely dripping through all the walls and everything, and you'd just be stood in water in the mine. It was very, very difficult conditions for them to kind of run something which had to be so precise as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well done.
I know they took in, I know that there are in the calculations that there are all parts about the temperatures, because they were taking temperatures very regularly and things like that, and taking that into account in the calculations. That's something that they certainly knew that would cause issues. But as I said, you know, the pendulums themselves, because they were second-hand pendulums, once again, they were quite rare objects at that point, these Qatar ones, because they'd only really been invented a few years before. So they were all made differently. So one of them had a brass shaft. So this was one of the problems we came up with which pendulum would we try and make? Because they were all different. And we decided to go for a bit of a hybrid in the end. And it was more what Wayne and the cost of material, because a full brass bob would have cost quite a lot of money to come across. So he actually made us something which was hollow, which actually worked well. And yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any more questions, please?
Just one quick one, Carol.
Yeah, sure, Kevin.
Follow on from the earlier question. How heavy was the bob on the pendulum?
So yes, when we actually saw the original one at the Science Museum, we weren't allowed to handle it. Well, Daniel wasn't allowed to handle it, nor the only person who was allowed to handle it was the curator. And one of the things that we didn't know was how heavy was the bob. So this was something that Wayne used to come back and question us all the time. Can you find out how heavy the bob was? So he made a bob. I don't know how heavy his bob was, but as I said, it was a hollow piece of brass about this big. But he managed to weight it with the bracket that went over the shaft correctly, so it would swing and everything. But yeah, there was huge questions on so many parts of that pendulum, and you can see all the different drawings of them, and you can see we took quite Daniel did very well at taking very good photographs of things, but things like weights and things weren't taken at the time for Wayne. And so when he made his pendulum, he had to go with a lot of his own experience of making clocks and fixing and putting clocks back together and everything. So yes, I can find out for you, Kevin, if you want, how heavy our bob was.
No, I'm just intrigued because in my early days working at the Science Museum, they had a free pendulum called the Foucault pendulum, and that had to be reset every hour, despite having a 20-meter long, a massive bob. The bob weighed about 15-20 pounds full of lead.
Okay.
But I mean, I assume the pendulum settled down to a fairly small arc very quickly, presumably.
Yeah.
Carolyn, one last question from me. You said that the original mines flooded. Is there anything left down there that you know of from your researches from the original experiment?
No, not that I know of. I know the second time when they came down, they had the mine managers build them like almost a wooden shed inside the bottom of the shaft to kind of enclose themselves, to give themselves some privacy. I don't think it helped particularly because the blasting and the kibble coming in and out would have still caused huge problems. But no, I don't think there would be anything down there. Okay. The mining went on for a long time after that, and they went a lot deeper and superseded things and probably blasted the area that they were in. And certainly the second area where there's been this shift in the actual mine itself, and then it was flooded. The story is that Airy was one of the last people to leave, and it was up to his knees in water before he would actually leave the bottom of the mine to make sure everything was out and before he stopped it and everything. So it's
fascinating, really fascinating. Well, I'm reluctant to draw this afternoon to an end. I wish it could go on, but we have our own practicalities to carry on with. I really want to, on behalf of the Society Council and the wider membership, to thank you, Carolyn, and all our speakers for fascinating talks and a tremendous. So if you wouldn't mind expressing your appreciation, please, in the usual manner, either electronically or online. So thank you, Megan, Carolyn, and Carolyn, for some excellent presentations this afternoon. Thank you.